Pete Rose once said Mike Schmidt was pathetic before he arrived in Philadelphia, claiming Schmidt only became the league's best player 7 days a week after watching Rose's relentless hustle. This might sound shocking, because we're talking about Mike Schmidt, a Hall of Famer with 548 home runs, 3 MVP awards, and 10 Gold Gloves. But here's the thing. Despite being the greatest player in Phillies history, Schmidt spent his entire career fighting accusations that he didn't care enough, didn't lead enough, and didn't fit the culture his team demanded. Legends like Rose, Larry Bowa, and Bruce Kison all had serious problems with how Schmidt carried himself. And decades later, those criticisms followed him into retirement when he sparked national controversies with comments about bat flips and language barriers. So what was it about Mike Schmidt that made even his own teammates question whether his greatness was enough? The story really begins in the late 70s when the Phillies were trying to build a championship team. Schmidt was already putting up incredible numbers. He was hitting home runs at a rate most players could only dream about. His power was unmatched. When he connected with a baseball, it was a thing of beauty. The ball would explode off his bat and disappear into the stands. Fans would stand and cheer. Announcers would call his name with reverence. But there was a problem lurking beneath all that success. Philadelphia is not an easy city to play in. The fans are intense. They live and breathe every pitch, every swing, every play. The media is ruthless, analyzing every mistake and questioning every decision. And the organization had a very specific vision for what their team should look like. Manager Dallas Green wanted a blue-collar identity. He wanted grit. Schmidt's personality didn't match that vision at all. He was quiet, analytical, and reserved. He approached baseball like a scientist studying data. He played the game with a business-like approach that seemed cold to fans and teammates who expected fire and passion. While other players were screaming in the dugout, pumping up their teammates, and wearing their emotions on their sleeves, Schmidt stayed calm. He didn't yell. He didn't throw tantrums. He didn't seem to get rattled by pressure. In many ways, this emotional control was exactly what made him so successful. It allowed him to perform consistently at the highest level. But to the people watching him, it looked like he didn't care. It looked like winning didn't matter to him as much as it should. Schmidt himself later admitted he was way too sensitive to handle the Philadelphia environment. He once famously said Philadelphia is the only city where you can experience the thrill of victory and the agony of reading about it the next day. That quote tells you everything about the tension that defined his career. He was a superstar who felt constantly attacked by the very city he was supposed to represent. He gave them championships. He gave them incredible performances, but he couldn't give them the emotional connection they desperately wanted. The psychological profile of Schmidt reveals something fascinating. Studies showed that his level-headed approach, his ability to avoid emotional responses to pressure, was directly correlated with his success. Players who stay calm under stress tend to have higher on-base percentages and better overall performance metrics. Schmidt was a master of this mental game. But in Philadelphia, where the culture demanded visible passion, this strength became his greatest weakness. Fans interpreted his calm demeanor as arrogance. They thought he believed he was too good to care about their opinions. Teammates saw it as a lack of fire. They wanted someone who would get angry when things went wrong, who would rally the troops with emotional speeches, who would show that losing hurt as much for him as it did for them. Schmidt couldn't be that person. It simply wasn't who he was. And that mismatch between his personality and the expectations of everyone around him created a conflict that would define every single year of his career. When Pete Rose arrived in Philadelphia in 1979, everything changed. Rose was everything Schmidt wasn't. He was loud, aggressive, and played with a hustle that made every single play look like it mattered more than life itself. Rose didn't just play hard. He made sure everyone knew he was playing hard. He dove headfirst into bases. He sprinted to first on walks. He talked constantly, encouraging teammates and challenging opponents. Rose was a showman who understood that baseball was as much about performance and energy as it was about statistics. And when Rose looked at Schmidt, he saw a player who was coasting on raw talent instead of maximizing every aspect of his game. Rose believed that hitting home runs wasn't enough to be truly great. He thought Schmidt needed to learn how to lead in base running, defense, and all the little things that don't show up in highlight reels. Rose publicly stated that Schmidt only became the best player 7 days a week after watching how Rose approached the game. Think about what that statement really means. Rose was saying that before his arrival, Schmidt was only great when he felt like being great. That on some days, Schmidt would show up and dominate, but on other days, he would just go through the motions. Rose believed his own relentless intensity taught Schmidt how to bring maximum effort every single day, regardless of how he felt. That comment wasn't a compliment. It was a direct criticism suggesting Schmidt had been lazy or incomplete before Rose showed him what real effort looked like. Schmidt later described Rose as the most likable, arrogant person he'd ever met, which shows there was respect between them. But it also reveals the core issue. Rose believed Schmidt's talent allowed him to skip the daily grind that other players had to embrace. And in Philadelphia, where effort and toughness mattered as much as results, that was an unforgivable flaw. The fascinating thing about Rose's criticism is that it wasn't about Schmidt's ability. Rose never questioned whether Schmidt could hit, field, or throw. He questioned Schmidt's mentality. Rose thought Schmidt was content to be great on his own terms rather than pushing himself to be great on everyone's terms. Rose wanted Schmidt to understand that true leadership meant showing other players how to work. It meant setting an example through visible hustle that younger players could follow. Schmidt's approach was different. He believed his statistics spoke for themselves. He thought producing results was the only leadership that mattered. This fundamental disagreement about what it means to be a leader created tension that lasted throughout their time as teammates. Rose saw himself as Schmidt's teacher, the veteran who arrived to fix what was broken. Schmidt saw himself as already complete, a superstar who didn't need lessons from anyone. Neither of them was entirely right or entirely wrong, but the conflict between their perspectives became part of the story that defined Schmidt's legacy. Larry Bowa was even more direct in his criticism of Schmidt. Bowa was the team's shortstop and one of the fiercest competitors in baseball. He had a fiery temper and wasn't afraid to yell at anyone, including the team's best player. Bowa and Schmidt clashed constantly because their personalities were complete opposites. Schmidt stayed calm and controlled, while Bowa exploded with emotion over every mistake. If a teammate missed a sign or didn't hustle, Bowa would scream at them right there on the field. He didn't care about feelings or egos. He cared about winning, and he believed that passion and intensity were essential ingredients for championship baseball. The tension between Bowa and Schmidt wasn't just personal, it was cultural. Bowa represented the blue-collar spirit that Dallas Green wanted to define the team. Schmidt represented individual excellence that didn't always translate into the kind of visible leadership the organization demanded. The most revealing part of this story is what happened when Bowa confronted Schmidt during a game. Bowa got into a yelling match with Schmidt right in front of everyone. The entire team could see it. Fans in the stands could see it. It was an explosive confrontation between two players who fundamentally disagreed about how the game should be played. Bowa expected to get punished for disrespecting a future Hall of Famer. In most organizations, yelling at your best player would be grounds for serious consequences. You don't publicly challenge your team's superstar without expecting backlash from management. But instead of punishment, Dallas Green pulled Bowa aside and praised him for getting on Schmidt. Green told Bowa he did exactly what needed to be done. He essentially gave Bowa permission to continue challenging Schmidt's approach and demanding more visible passion. That moment shows how deep the organizational frustration with Schmidt ran. Management actively wanted Schmidt to be challenged and criticized because they believed his calm demeanor was holding the team back. They thought if they could break through his emotional reserve and force him to show more fire, the entire team would benefit. Schmidt wasn't being attacked by jealous teammates. He was being attacked because the Phillies' leadership believed his personality was a problem that needed to be fixed. This was management-sanctioned confrontation. Green was using Bowa as a tool to try to change Schmidt's fundamental nature. And the fact that this strategy was considered necessary tells you how seriously the organization viewed Schmidt's emotional detachment as a liability. They had one of the greatest players in baseball history on their roster, and instead of celebrating him, they were trying to transform him into someone completely different. If you've ever felt like you were great at something, but still couldn't get people to believe in you, drop a comment about it. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of baseball's most complicated legends, hit that subscribe button because we've got a lot more to uncover. Schmidt eventually acknowledged how badly he handled the Philadelphia pressure. Years later, he admitted he had big-time regrets about his relationship with the fans and media. He confessed that he was just way too sensitive and didn't have the kind of personality that could thrive in that environment. This admission is important because it shows Schmidt understood the problem. He knew he didn't fit. He knew his quiet demeanor created friction. But understanding the problem didn't mean he could fix it. Some aspects of personality are so fundamental that changing them feels impossible. Schmidt specifically mentioned that he lacked a Tug McGraw type of attitude, referring to the beloved Phillies pitcher who was famous for his carefree, fun-loving approach to the game. McGraw would joke with fans, laugh at himself, and treat every game like a celebration. He made baseball look fun. Schmidt made baseball look like work. He knew he wasn't built to be McGraw, but the damage was already done. The fans had formed their opinion of him, and it was almost impossible to change. In 1985, things hit rock bottom. Schmidt made comments calling Philadelphia fans a mob scene and claiming they were uncontrollable. He went even further, suggesting he would have had much more success if he'd played in a less demanding city like Los Angeles. These comments were devastating to his relationship with the city. Fans felt betrayed. Here was their best player essentially saying he wished he played somewhere else. He was saying that Philadelphia, with all its passion and intensity, was a burden rather than a blessing. The fans were furious. They had supported him through everything. They had cheered his home runs and defended his place as the face of the franchise. And now he was telling them they were the problem. When the team came back home for their next game, Schmidt ran onto the field wearing sunglasses and a long-haired wig. It was supposed to be a joke, a way to deflect the boos and show he could laugh at himself. The idea was that if he mocked himself first, the fans couldn't hurt him, but it didn't work. It just made him look like he was mocking the fans instead of respecting their passion. That moment became a symbol of everything people disliked about Schmidt. He couldn't handle criticism, he couldn't connect with the people who supported him, and when things got tough, he tried to hide behind gimmicks instead of confronting the problem directly. A different player might have held a press conference, apologized sincerely, and tried to explain his perspective while acknowledging the fans' right to be upset. Schmidt chose to wear a disguise and turn his return into theater. It was a defensive move that revealed just how uncomfortable he was with vulnerability. He couldn't simply stand there and take the criticism. He needed a shield. And that shield, ridiculous as it was, perfectly captured the disconnect between Schmidt and Philadelphia. He was trying to protect himself when what people wanted was for him to open up. The tension between Schmidt's controlled personality and the emotional demands of his environment exploded in 1977 during a game against the Pittsburgh Pirates. Schmidt had built his entire career on staying calm and focused no matter what happened on the field. Other players would get angry when hit by pitches or trash-talked by opponents. Schmidt would just move on to the next play. He prided himself on never letting external factors affect his performance, but that composure cracked during a heated moment with Pirates pitcher Bruce Kison. In the 7th inning, Kison hit Schmidt with a pitch. Now, getting hit by a pitch is part of baseball. It happens. Most players take their base and move on. But something about this particular moment triggered Schmidt in a way nothing else had before. Schmidt immediately started yelling threats at Kison from first base. He wasn't going to let it go. He wanted Kison to know he wasn't going to be pushed around. Kison didn't back down. He stared at Schmidt and shouted back, asking, "Why don't you come now?" That challenge was all it took. Schmidt charged the mound and a massive bench-clearing brawl broke out. Both teams emptied their dugouts and met in a chaotic pile near the pitcher's mound. Punches were thrown. Players were wrestling on the ground. It was the kind of baseball fight that gets replayed on highlight shows for years. The fight itself wasn't unusual. Baseball has always had moments like that. Players defend their teammates and their pride. But what happened next showed the real cost of Schmidt's rare emotional outbursts. During the brawl, Schmidt dislocated his finger. The injury was serious enough to affect his performance for the rest of the season. His grip on the bat was compromised. His throwing accuracy suffered. He was visibly playing hurt, and it showed in his numbers. Later that year in the National League Championship Series, Schmidt hit just .063, one of the worst playoff performances of his career. His team needed him to be great when it mattered most, and he couldn't deliver because of an injury he sustained during an unnecessary fight that resulted from losing his composure. The lesson was clear. When Schmidt's carefully controlled emotions finally broke through, the results were destructive. He didn't channel his competitive fire into productive aggression. Instead, he made an impulsive decision that physically hurt him and compromised his ability to help his team when it mattered most. This incident reinforced the criticism that Schmidt's emotional reserve wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a psychological defense mechanism. And when that defense failed, he struggled to handle the chaos that followed. If Schmidt had maintained his usual calm, he would have taken his base, moved on, and been healthy for the playoffs. Instead, he let emotion take over for one moment, and it cost him dearly. Throughout his career, Schmidt was constantly compared to George Brett, the Kansas City Royals' third baseman who was his rival for the title of best player at the position. Brett and Schmidt faced each other in the 1980 World Series and battled for MVP awards throughout the decade. Their rivalry was interesting because they were so evenly matched in talent, but so different in personality. Brett was beloved by fans for his intensity and passion. He played with a raw emotion that made every at-bat look like a battle for his life. When Brett got a big hit, his joy was visible and infectious. When he failed, his frustration was equally obvious. Fans connected with that authenticity. Schmidt was respected for his dominance, but never quite loved the same way. His excellence felt distant and impersonal. Fans admired his statistics but didn't feel like they knew him as a person. Brett once talked about how Schmidt constantly tried to one-up him in everything. He mentioned that Schmidt was drafted 30th in 1971, just one pick after Brett went 29th. That small difference seemed to matter to Schmidt. It was like he needed to prove that being picked one spot later didn't mean he was any less valuable. Brett's comments suggest that Schmidt's competitiveness was intensely personal and internal. He was constantly measuring himself against others, trying to prove he was the best. He kept track of every comparison, every statistic, every accolade. But that drive for individual excellence often came across as isolation rather than leadership. Schmidt was competing to validate his own greatness, not to lift up the people around him. That distinction explains why teammates like Pete Rose and Larry Bowa felt Schmidt wasn't giving enough to the collective effort. He was locked in his own psychological battle for historical recognition, while they wanted someone who would fight alongside them every single day. Brett saw their rivalry as mutual respect between two great players. Schmidt seemed to see it as a personal mission to prove his superiority. This internal focus on legacy and individual achievement became another piece of evidence that Schmidt prioritized his own success over team unity. It wasn't that he wanted the team to lose, but his primary motivation seemed to be cementing his place in history rather than building bonds with the players in the clubhouse. The most revealing moment of Schmidt's entire career happened on April 18, 1987, when he hit his 500th home run. It was a dramatic three-run blast in the ninth inning against the Pittsburgh Pirates that won the game for the Phillies. The pitcher was Don Robinson. Schmidt knew the ball was gone the moment he made contact. What happened next shocked everyone who knew him. Schmidt jubilantly slapped his hands together, engaged in an animated dash around the bases, and punched the air with pure joy. He was laughing, celebrating, and showing more emotion than anyone had ever seen from him in his entire career. His face was lit up with happiness. His body language was completely different from the controlled, measured way he usually carried himself. Teammates, fans, and media members were stunned. This was not the Mike Schmidt they knew. This was someone who looked like he was experiencing the greatest moment of his life. The legendary Phillies announcer Harry Kalas gave one of the most emotional calls of his career as Schmidt rounded the bases. Kalas's voice cracked with feeling as he described the historic moment. It was the kind of call that becomes part of baseball history. Afterward, Schmidt made a characteristically dry joke. He said he thought Kalas would show a little emotion. That comment was classic Schmidt, using humor to deflect from his own rare moment of vulnerability. He couldn't just accept that he'd shown genuine feeling. He had to joke about someone else not being emotional enough, even though Kalas had been incredibly emotional. It was like Schmidt needed to protect himself from being seen as too human. But here's what that moment really revealed. Schmidt's emotional reserve was not natural or unavoidable. It was a choice. He carefully regulated when and how he expressed passion. His ability to show such explosive joy for his 500th home run proved that the emotion was always there, buried beneath the surface. He just chose not to let it out most of the time. And the only time he allowed himself to truly celebrate with unrestrained joy was when he achieved a personal milestone that confirmed his place in baseball history. He didn't celebrate like that when the team won big games. He didn't show that kind of fire during championship runs. He saved his deepest emotions for the moments that were about him and his individual legacy. That's why teammates criticized him for being selfish. It wasn't that he didn't care about baseball. It was that he seemed to care most about his own historical validation rather than the collective success of the team. When the Phillies won, Schmidt was happy in his controlled, measured way. But when he hit number 500, he lost control completely. The message was clear to everyone watching. Schmidt's passion was reserved for personal achievement. Team success was nice. Individual milestones were everything. This perception, fair or not, became central to how people understood Schmidt's priorities. He was a player who cared deeply about being great, but not as deeply about being a great teammate. After Schmidt retired, he became a broadcaster and instructor for the Phillies. But instead of softening his image or connecting better with the next generation of players, he became a cultural critic who exposed the same rigid thinking that had caused problems during his playing career. Schmidt positioned himself as a defender of baseball's unwritten rules and traditional values. He believed the game should be played a certain way, with certain standards of respect and decorum. And in doing so, he sparked controversies that reminded everyone why he'd always been such a polarizing figure. His post-playing career showed that time and distance hadn't changed his fundamental worldview. He still saw the game through the lens of his own experience, and he struggled to understand or accept perspectives that differed from his own. In 2016, Schmidt publicly criticized Jose Bautista's famous bat flip from the 2015 playoffs. Bautista hit a massive home run in a crucial moment and flipped his bat in celebration. It became one of the most iconic images in modern baseball. Fans loved it. It was raw, authentic emotion in a high-pressure situation. Bautista had delivered when his team needed him most, and he celebrated accordingly. But Schmidt called it a flagrant disrespect of the opponent. He argued that kind of behavior would have gotten somebody hurt back in the day. Schmidt's position was that players needed to show restraint and respect even in moments of triumph. He believed that celebrating too much was essentially rubbing salt in the opponent's wound. The problem was that Schmidt's criticism immediately drew accusations of hypocrisy. Analysts pointed out that Schmidt had celebrated his 500th home run with extreme emotion and visible joy. He had run around the bases pumping his fist and showing pure elation. So why was it acceptable for him to celebrate a personal milestone, but not acceptable for Bautista to celebrate a crucial playoff moment? The answer seemed to be that Schmidt believed emotional expression was only earned through the highest level of career achievement. In his mind, hitting your 500th home run gave you the right to celebrate because you'd reached a historic plateau that only a handful of players ever achieve. But showing enthusiasm in a playoff game was somehow disrespectful, regardless of how important that moment was to your team. That double standard revealed a fundamental flaw in Schmidt's thinking. He wanted to police how other players express themselves based on an arbitrary, proprietary standard that he'd created for himself. He was essentially saying that only certain kinds of achievement warranted celebration, and he got to decide which kinds those were. The hypocrisy was obvious to everyone except Schmidt. He couldn't see that his own emotional outburst and Bautista's bat flip were fundamentally the same thing. Players showing joy in moments that mattered deeply to them. The only difference was that Schmidt's moment was about individual legacy, while Bautista's was about team success. And somehow Schmidt viewed his own motivation as more legitimate. It showed that even decades after retirement, Schmidt still struggled to understand perspectives different from his own. He was stuck in a rigid set of beliefs about how the game should be played, and he couldn't accept that the game was evolving beyond his narrow definition of acceptable behavior. The worst controversy of Schmidt's post-playing career happened in 2017, when he made comments about Phillies outfielder Odubel Herrera. Schmidt was doing a radio interview and was asked about Herrera's potential as a franchise player. Herrera was a talented young outfielder who showed flashes of brilliance. He could hit for average, steal bases, and play good defense. The question was whether he could become the kind of player you build a team around. Schmidt's response ignited a national backlash that went far beyond Philadelphia. He claimed that Herrera couldn't be a major building block for the team, primarily because of a language barrier. Schmidt elaborated by saying that because Herrera didn't speak fluent English, he couldn't sit in a circle with 4 or 5 American players and talk about the game. He said Herrera couldn't verbally instruct teammates by telling them things like, "Man, you gotta run that ball out." Schmidt argued that this language limitation prevented Herrera from being a true leader. In his mind, leadership required the ability to communicate verbally in English with American players. Without that ability, a player could be talented and productive, but he couldn't be the foundation of a franchise. Schmidt was drawing directly from his own experience in the 1980s Phillies clubhouse, where verbal confrontation and aggressive communication were valued by management. Pete Rose would yell at players to hustle. Larry Bowa would scream at teammates who missed signs. That was the only form of leadership Schmidt understood. So when he looked at Herrera, he couldn't see past the language difference to recognize that leadership comes in many forms. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Fans, media members, and players across baseball accused Schmidt of cultural bias and insensitivity. Social media exploded with criticism. People pointed out that plenty of Latin American players had become franchise cornerstones and team leaders despite English not being their first language. Roberto Clemente led through example and character. Albert Pujols led through consistent excellence and work ethic. Vladimir Guerrero led through passion and joy for the game. None of them needed to give speeches in perfect English to be considered leaders. Critics argued that Schmidt's comments revealed a narrow, outdated, and frankly discriminatory view of what leadership looks like. Leadership doesn't require being able to give verbal speeches in English. Leadership can come from work ethic, attitude, performance, and setting an example through actions rather than words. Herrera himself responded through an interpreter with remarkable grace and dignity. He accepted Schmidt's apology but respectfully disagreed with the entire premise of the criticism. Herrera explained that while he wanted to improve his English, he believed leadership could be expressed in other ways. He specifically mentioned bringing energy to the team as his form of leadership. Herrera said he tried to play hard every day, show passion on the field, and encourage teammates through his actions. He believed that kind of leadership was just as valuable as verbal communication. His response was measured, thoughtful, and showed more cultural awareness than Schmidt had demonstrated. Herrera understood that different people lead in different ways, and that's perfectly acceptable. That response exposed the core problem with Schmidt's worldview. Schmidt's definition of leadership was based entirely on his experience in the 1980s Phillies clubhouse, where verbal confrontation and aggressive communication were valued by management. He'd been surrounded by players like Pete Rose and Larry Bowa, who led through loud, in-your-face intensity. That was the only model of leadership he'd ever known or respected. Schmidt never learned to recognize or value the quieter, performance-based leadership styles common among players from different cultural backgrounds. He was stuck in a rigid, outdated understanding of what leadership looks like, and he couldn't adapt to the modern, multicultural reality of baseball. The game had changed dramatically since his playing days, but his thinking hadn't evolved at all. Schmidt eventually issued a public apology for the Herrera comments, but even that apology became controversial. He began the statement by saying, "It's been made known to me that my answer was disrespectful." That phrasing immediately drew criticism because it suggested Schmidt only realized he'd been offensive after other people told him. He didn't seem to understand on his own why the comments were hurtful. He was essentially saying that he didn't think his words were problematic until the backlash forced him to reconsider. That's not genuine understanding, that's damage control. He went on to describe the backlash as a misrepresentation of his answer and said his comments may have offended someone. Media analysts tore apart that language. By calling it a misrepresentation, Schmidt was essentially blaming others for misunderstanding his intent rather than taking full responsibility for what he actually said. He was suggesting that his words were fine, but people interpreted them incorrectly. That's not how apologies work. You don't get to tell people they misunderstood you when what you said was clearly offensive. And by saying his words may have offended someone, he was minimizing the harm and suggesting that people were overreacting. A genuine apology would have acknowledged the comments were wrong, explained why they were wrong, and committed to doing better. Instead, Schmidt's apology read like a defensive statement from someone who still didn't fully grasp the problem. This pattern of deflecting accountability had defined Schmidt's entire public life. In the 1980s, he blamed Philadelphia fans for being too intense instead of adjusting his approach to connect with them. He called them a mob scene and suggested he would have been better off playing somewhere else. When they booed him, he wore a disguise instead of facing them honestly. In 2017, he blamed people for misinterpreting his words about Herrera instead of acknowledging the cultural insensitivity in what he'd said. Schmidt's greatest flaw was never about his talent on the field. It was about his inability to communicate effectively, take genuine responsibility, or adapt to perspectives beyond his own narrow experience. He was brilliant at baseball but struggled with the human side of the game throughout his entire life. Looking back at all the criticisms Mike Schmidt faced from Pete Rose, Larry Bowa, Bruce Kison, George Brett, and others, a clear pattern emerges. None of these legends ever questioned Schmidt's ability to play baseball at the highest level. His 548 home runs, 3 MVP awards, 10 Gold Gloves, and Hall of Fame induction are undeniable proof of his greatness. The numbers speak for themselves. Schmidt was one of the most dominant players in baseball history. But every single conflict, controversy, and criticism centered on his personality, his leadership style, and his cultural flexibility. Rose thought Schmidt needed to be taught how to play hard every single day, not just when he felt like hitting home runs. Bowa and Dallas Green believed Schmidt's calm demeanor was a problem that needed to be confronted and corrected. Bruce Kison exposed how Schmidt's rare emotional outbursts could be destructive and costly. George Brett's Rivalry revealed how Schmidt's competitiveness was intensely internal and isolated rather than team-focused. The 500th home run celebration showed that Schmidt only expressed deep emotion for personal milestones. And the Bautista and Herrera controversies proved that Schmidt carried a rigid, culturally inflexible worldview into his later years. The psychological analysis of Schmidt's career shows that his level-headed, unemotional approach actually helped him succeed on the field. It allowed him to stay consistent and avoid the mental swings that destroy other players. Players who can maintain composure under pressure perform better over long seasons. Schmidt's ability to shut out external noise and focus purely on performance was a massive advantage. But in the emotionally charged blue-collar culture of Philadelphia baseball, that same emotional control was seen as arrogance, indifference, and a lack of heart. The very trait that made him great was also what made him controversial. The question at the heart of Mike Schmidt's legacy is whether greatness requires connection or if performance alone is enough. Schmidt proved you can dominate a sport through sheer talent and mental discipline without being loved by fans or embraced by teammates. He showed that you don't need to be charismatic or emotionally expressive to put up Hall of Fame numbers, but he also proved that excellence without charisma creates a complicated, uncomfortable legacy. People will always debate whether Schmidt should have changed to fit Philadelphia's culture or whether Philadelphia should have appreciated him for exactly who he was. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Schmidt's talent demanded respect, but his inability to connect made that respect feel cold and distant. He was the greatest third baseman of his generation and one of the most dominant players in baseball history. But he was also a psychological isolate who spent 4 decades fighting the perception that his greatness wasn't enough. The criticisms from legends weren't about his statistics. They were about the human side of the game that Schmidt never quite figured out. And that tension between excellence and connection is what makes his story so endlessly fascinating. Schmidt wanted to be judged purely on his performance. But sports don't work that way. Fans need more than numbers. Teammates need more than talent. And Schmidt could never fully provide what they were asking for. So here's the final question. Do you think Mike Schmidt's personality flaws matter when his on-field performance was so undeniably great? Should we judge athletes only by their results, or do leadership and cultural fit matter just as much? Drop your thoughts in the comments and make sure you're subscribed because we've got plenty more stories about the complicated legends of baseball history. Thanks for watching.